Welcome to the Journal podcast from the Chartered Insurance Institute, a place for thought-provoking discussion from the world of insurance and beyond. My name is Harry Elliott, and I'm brand manager here at the Chartered Insurance Institute. In today's episode, we'll be exploring where insurance really comes from and why its history matters more than ever. From the earliest risks faced by society to the changes brought on by the Industrial Revolution, we'll trace just how insurance evolved into the profession we know today. We'll also be looking at the role of the Insurance Museum in bringing this story to life, connecting past, present and future, supporting learning, CPD and professional standards, and really helping us understand why regulation and professionalism sits at the heart of trust in insurance. Joining me today on the podcast is Howard Benge, Director of the Insurance Museum, and I'm very, very pleased for you to be joining me today, Howard. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Harry. And pleasure to be here.
No worries. So I guess the first thing to sort of kick us off, Howard, is talk us a little about the role and the purpose of the Insurance Museum.
Yeah, absolutely. The museum, the Insurance Museum, is a registered charity. It was set up in 2020. It actually came out of the CII, believe it or not. The CII was in Insurers Hall in Aldermanbury, up by the Guildhall. And I can't remember what year it was. Is it 2018, 2019? The building was sold. The Chartered Insurance Institute moved elsewhere. But within that building, there had been a museum and an archive and a library. And I think the question was, well, what do we do with this? My boss, who's the chair of the Insurance Museum charity, Reg Brown, he was tasked with the scope, with the question, the feasibility of what do we do with this? And to cut a long story short, he came back and said, we need a museum. So it started off as a project around that time, and it was doing really, really well, gaining momentum, gaining traction and support. And then COVID happened, of course, and the world changed. But in that time, the museum was set up, as I said, as a registered UK charity, and it's got a board of 8 people. And I was brought on in early 22 to get it going, to actually get the whole thing going. So we've got a long-term view and a medium and a short-term view, which I'll go over. But essentially, the museum is, and you mentioned those words, it's about telling the story of global insurance, past, present, and future. And that's to all audiences, but it is importantly to the insurance community, to young people, schools, and the general public as well. And enlighten everybody what a fantastic area insurance is and what a great place it is to work in as well.
Yeah, well said. Couldn't have put it much better myself, Howard. So talking about telling a story, I guess that leads me on to say, in terms of the earliest societies, talking about the history of insurance, what were the fundamental risks that those early societies were trying to protect themselves from?
Yeah, I mean, people say insurance goes back to ancient China, it goes back to here, it goes back to Babylon. Yes, absolutely it does, but not quite the insurance we'd recognize today. But I think what we're referring to is the broader church of what insurance is, and it's risk management, basically. My background is, I'm not an insurer. My background is museums heritage, but in particular, prehistory and archaeology. And my specialist period was the Iron Age. That's the pre-Roman Britain. But you can see risk management in the archaeological record and in the landscape. And let's face it, humanity is risky, isn't it? And you have to protect yourself. Thinking back to those pre-Roman societies, that you have to protect yourself from bad harvest, from poor weather, from travel, from invasion, from angry animals, all those sorts of things. And you can see that in the structure of a village or a settlement as well. But even fire too. If you're looking at an Iron Age roundhouse, the fire was organized, it was controlled. And even if you step into the Roman world, into this organized, civilized Roman world, there were fire brigades in the Roman Empire. So there's always been this management of risk. People knew what the risks were. And of course, they were working around them.
Pick up something you said at the start there, Howard. It's not insurance as we would know it today. It was more the risk management side of things. So when do you think, or how did insurance come to exist out of that risk management sort of theory?
Yeah, well, when we start looking at history as opposed to archaeology. So imagine archaeology, we excavate sites, we look at landscapes, we try and work out what was going on. But we usually start looking at history where you have written records and paintings and diaries and documents to work on, people's actual handwriting of the detail. We start seeing glimpses of insurance in the 1300s. Now, that's a big jump, isn't it? From, say, the Roman period, it's 13, 12, 1100 years. But the first written records and the first evidence, and I emphasize that word, evidence we have, is actually the 1300s in the northern Italian states. Now, that's time and previous to the 1300s, so the 1200s as well, the early medieval periods there, the Italian states were very powerful. And what I mean by the states wasn't Italy per se, it was Florence and Venice, Milan, all those states, nation states that are at war with each other. They're in competition with each other, and they started showing off by building magnificent walls around their cities and buildings and duomos and doge palaces and so on. And but they're also investing heavily in art as well as architecture. Really were showing off. But what underlined that was trade. And that trade, Italy was the center, almost the center of the world, not religiously, but commercially, with its connections north into Northern Europe, south into Africa, and east into Asia, Persia, and beyond into East Asia as well. And it was sort of that hub of trade. And with that trade, with international connections, but the Lombardies were establishing banks, were establishing double entry bookkeeping. But also we have a glimpse of insurance, actual contracts, actual written records of actual insurance. So, for example, 1320s, I think it was, and forgive me, I'm an archaeologist, so I don't always remember the exact dates. I'm not a historian. So around 1320s, there was the first reference of insurance in a ledger in Genoa, and that refers to insurance being purchased. So it's not the actual policy, it's not the actual contract, but it's a reference to it being purchased. And then for 1340s, there is an actual contract of a policy of a ship. Again, they're merchants, these guys, sailing from a shipment from Genoa, then down through to Sicily, and it's a shipment of wool. And within that contract, there are the ship owners, the merchants, the ship itself, all the details you would expect. And that's the first policy we have. And then going on through that century, in all the documents in the archives, mainly seen in Genoa, is evidence for reinsurance, evidence for brokers, and the terminology that you and everybody listening will probably recognize as well. It's all in Latin, but you probably recognize the terminology that was being used. So that's always the first glimpse of actual insurance as we'd recognize it that we have in the historical record. But archives are so dense. They're so thick with documents. Honestly, I worked in archives with these thick books with page after page after page from the 1400s, and they're written their handwriting to seem quite small, maximizing space on the paper, and imagine how the records were kept. So my point is that I'm sure insurance was being practiced in the 1200s. We just haven't found the evidence for it yet. It's probably there, probably is, but we just haven't found it. It's like a needle in a haystack.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's really fascinating. When you talk about the depth of the archives and the fact that a lot of the terminology and bits in use in the 13th century and the 14th century in Italy, we can still see today. That's really, really fascinating. I want to pick out fire insurance specifically. You mentioned earlier that, obviously fire has been an ever-present across societies. As you mentioned, the fire brigade in Roman times, but there's a general consensus within insurance that fire insurance is seen almost as a turning point. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit as to why that might be.
Yeah, it was. I mean, as you said, there's fire management, and there were forms of fire insurance as regards clubs or societies. Hamburg had an insurance scheme, but the turning point, we always say the turning point came in London in the late 17th century, the 1600s. We all probably know that out of the Great Fire of London in 1666 came the fire insurance companies. And Nicholas Barban, seen as father of fire insurance, he was a property developer. In fact, he originally was a doctor. He was a medical doctor, but he went to the Netherlands to train as a doctor, came back just pre the fire, the Great Fire. And afterwards, he started sort of dabbling in development, redeveloping London out of the Great Fire. And that sort of gradually built and took off. And he was, by the 1670s, he was earning quite a lot of money. And he was selling an insurance scheme along with his properties, his property development. But at some point, he, and perhaps his colleagues, his partners, he had lots of, he had a big network of people. He decided to set up an fire insurance company. It's called the Fire Office. And that was set up in 1680. Established what was described as, because they didn't have addresses then at that time, it was described as at the backside of the Royal Exchange. So somewhere at the back of the Royal Exchange was his office selling fire insurance. He introduced standard policy. So a policy you looked at, you'd recognize it as a premium based on a very rudimentary calculation of property value and so on. I can't say it's rudimentary. At that time, they were learning about where you put your premiums on that building. Because no one really done this before. It was a joint stock company. So he had partners investing in it. I think there's about 12 or so, perhaps a few more partners who are investing in it. And he also practiced the risk management as well, because he established a fire brigade, so an early firefighting equipment. The idea being that if a fire got hold of a building that they insured, they had a fire brigade that would put it out and reduce the risk, the financial risk of his company paying out. But something, Harry, you'd probably be interested in is also the branding, which is really important in the marketing, in that he introduced what's called the fire mark. Now everybody says, it was to identify which house was insured by that company, the Fire Office. And it was for the fire brigade to see and so on. It's about a foot high, it was brightly coloured, but it was also for marketing. If you imagine walking through the city of London and there's a building with the phoenix, the emblem, the brand of the logo of the Fire Office, brightly coloured, brightly painted.
That's fantastic. And it's really interesting you mentioned the branding of it. And in fact, looking at our logo today, there's a lot of elements within that, but one of the key themes is the fire mark in there. So that's very much from the turning point of insurance. And so I want to pick up, you mentioned how we've covered off sort of late medieval, the Italian influence and how that was all around trade. And we've now sort of moved to 17th century London and fire. Those sort of early schemes, are you seeing how that paves the way for modern insurance models? And can you see those symbols between the two?
Yeah. At the same time, 1690s, 1700s, famously Edward Lloyd's coffee shop, it's just operating around the corner of where, Barban's office was. But really, the marine insurance was still very much merchant insurance. They were insuring themselves, insuring each other. It's a bit of a closed shop. But I think really the turning point came that it paved the way to what we have now, is that the Fire Office and all those fire insurance companies that came afterwards. So there was the Hand in Hand, the Friends Society, Sun, Fire Office. They were selling insurance on the open market. Anybody could buy it. You didn't have to be in marine. All you needed was a house. You could choose which company you want to buy your fire insurance off. It was very competitive, fiercely competitive between all those fire companies. By the early 1700s, we're moving on now. And yet they operated in a free market. So that's one of the ways that really paved its way and influenced, as you say, modern insurance, is that we can now go look at what we want to buy, what the product is, what's best value, what we want to cover. Do we have Rolexes in our house? Do we not? It affects what policy we have, and also the price, and maybe even, the brand as well. Who do we trust? Do we trust a company you've never heard of before that pops up on your search engine? Or do we go with an established company that's been going on years? So, I think it developed that sort of way of thinking. Who do we go for in this free market? And of course, there were mergers and takeovers in the companies. They were, trying to get their business, easy way to do that. Some of them became very strong in what they were doing. Some of them failed. So that first one, the Fire Office, Barban's, by the 1700s, it had finished, it had run its course. But other companies, the Sun Fire Office, one of them, became very big. And I reckon I'd say if anybody's looking out for those fire marks, they'll probably see a Sun Fire Office. That became one of the main companies. And of course, you can see that looking backwards as well. So I'd say one of the ways, direct ways, is that free market approach. We do have regulation, of course, and so on and so forth. But it is that idea that it's selling insurance to individuals who are looking for something specific.
Sure, that makes total sense. And if I could move us forward 100 years or so, and talk about the Industrial Revolution and the role that had. And I'm thinking from where the CI sits today, and we've got all of our wonderful local institutes up and down the country. So I wonder, firstly, the role the Industrial Revolution played in the transformation of insurance and what new risks emerged as these sort of industries and cities expanded. It was maybe less of a London focus, perhaps.
Yeah, well, absolutely. It was becoming, I mean, London was the focus for fire insurance in the early 1700s. But, there were entrepreneurs everywhere and they're seeing ways to make money. And Bristol, Manchester, they're all cities that are up and coming. Liverpool, Norwich was still, very much one of the main cities. But yeah, the Industrial Revolution did change the landscape of the country. And so you had these big industrial centers with dense housing, but also factories, mills, and so on. And even London was developing like this. It became a major industrial center. One of the ways that it impacted insurance was the fact that suddenly, especially with fire insurance, let's keep to that for the moment, the processes and the materials were all new to everyone. And if you think that the fire insurance companies were by the mid 1700s, as we're going into the Industrial Revolution, still operating on that let's put the fire out first model, it wasn't fit for purpose come, these big factories and warehouses whereby there were boilers and there were furnaces, there were very high risk when it came to fire. The materials are flammable. And there were cases early on, and people learned, but for example, of cotton being stored next to the furnaces, that's a crazy idea. And you get to the points in the later 18th century where fire insurance companies were not going to insure sugar production because it was explosive. But they were learning that actually what is explosive, what is flammable, why. There were some major fires and every city will have their story. For example, in Exeter, it's not industrial related, but there was a huge fire in a theatre, something that came out of that urbanization of the Industrial Revolution, people living in one place, big theatres, big buildings, for example. So London had its huge fires. There was the Albion Mills fire, which was massive industrial processing of flour. So there was a lot to learn, and the insurance world did catch up, but very slowly. It was fits and starts, learning about processes, learning about sources of fire. And, it sounds like fire training now, doesn't it? Identifying fires. So learning about how to minimize that. And new roles came on board. So loss adjusters, for example, surveyors, a lot of paperwork started building up with the insurance companies. And they were actually finding that those coffee houses they're originally in the first part of the 18th century were becoming useless place to work for fire insurance, great to sell, but actually they started building and moving into offices. And by the 1800s, there were these offices that the insurance companies were in. They had different floors for different purposes. They had all these different specialist jobs. They got bigger, more successful in the 1970s, 1800s, bigger buildings, bigger workforces. You've got those, the Prudential is a great one. These wonderful buildings that, were built in the city centres around the country. More scope for women to work within insurance as well. Tended to be middle-class women who are educated, work in administration, clerical work. And that was coming towards the end of the 19th century. So you really see that development of this small company with a few people in coffee houses, moving through to very complex, different roles, different offices, more people, bigger premises. And it was part of that wider industrial revolution. And I haven't even mentioned the development of marine either. But just bear that in mind, I'd say, think about how the empire developed.
Absolutely. That's really fascinating. Thank you for sharing, Howard. And what's clear to me is that rapid expansion in a relatively quite short space of time. But I wanted to talk specifically about the Insurance Museum now, if that's okay. And mentioned a little bit at the top of the podcast, your role in the Insurance Museum. But I wondered for maybe some of our listeners who are a little bit less familiar with the Insurance Museum, what role do you play in sort of connecting the past, the present, the future, and a little bit more generally about what it is you do?
Yeah, as I said earlier, my role is to get the Insurance Museum set up. So it doesn't happen overnight. And what I've been doing up to now is working on our profile, working on our direction of travel, all that behind the scenes sort of work. But I've been running podcasts and like this, webinars, and also tours. So I've been reaching out, and these are directed at the insurance profession, the insurance community, let's say, because it's more than just underwriters. So the entire insurance community, offering tours, and I'm going to be running some with the CII later on this month, and engaging people within insurance, get on board with what we want to do. Tell the story, the history of it and heritage, absolutely. But also explain what insurance is, what it is, how it works, how it benefits society, individuals, all the issues around it as well. I think it was one of my colleagues said you wrote down in one of the early business plans was the most incredible thing about insurance is that no one knows about it. And people will switch off. They'll switch off when you talk about insurance. So we want to open up those doors with exhibitions, with programs, with events and so on. But one of the key things is getting schools, young people on board. And we've just received a grant from the lottery funds, the National Lottery Heritage Fund, that will fund a 3-year program into researching and the insurance heritage, but also in the education and engagement area, which is developing a schools program, trying it out, having events, having exhibitions. We're hoping later on this year, we'll announce it soon, an exhibition on early insurance, a bit of what I've been talking about. It's going to be really exciting. So keep an eye out for that, everyone. I'm not going to say it now. No spoiling.
Really exciting news, and congratulations on the grant. That really is fantastic to hear.
Yeah, thank you.
And if I'm thinking about our listeners and with my sort of members hat on, how does the museum support sort of learning and CPD, maybe professional development from that aspect?
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of angles we can take. I mean, about meaning and purpose. What are you doing, why you're doing it? That's quite important. It sounds like it's a soft skill, isn't it? A soft piece of knowledge to learn. But why are you doing what you're doing? Where does it come from? It's not just about making money for yourself, for shareholders, for owners. It's more than that. It's a lot more than that. It's almost like a service that society needs in the private sector. And I think, a lot of insurers know this, but where did it come from and why? So it's about meaning and purpose. I mentioned those tours, the CII, they're for new starters. So to give people an essence, a background of what they're doing, why it's happening here, and why it's happening at all, really, I suppose. I mean, for example, the things we can look at are events and what came out of those events. So there was the Piper Alpha, for example, which led to the disaster in 1988, which led to a huge redevelopment in insurance. Some people coming in now might look at insurance and say, well, why are we doing this? Why do we have this way of working? Why do we have this framework? Why do we have this procedures, this legislation? Why? There's usually a reason for it. So we can look at those recent events and we can look at what came out of them and why things are being delivered as they are. I'm trying to condense this in a very short way. So, why are we doing what we're doing? I mean, the recent history of insurance will show that. And there's other things such as leadership. I mean, the way that Cuthbert Heath showed in Lloyd's of London when in the 1906 fire in San Francisco, when he said pay all claims, he took that leadership role without bickering about anything, just said pay all claims. And that helped put Lloyd's of London on the international map. So it's these little nuggets that build up to an understanding of the sector you're in and why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great to hear. And also, thank you for sharing some of the plans for the future of the insurance museum. I'm sure our listeners will be keeping their eyes peeled for that. Just to wrap things up, apologies in advance to put you on the spot a little bit here, Howard, but we've talked a lot about the history of insurance and how that's all developed and how we see those sort of links between history and today. Taking that a step further, how might you think future generations would look back on 2026 or how insurance is in the here and now?
I think people would be looking at events. So let's just go back 6 years, which seems like yesterday, when COVID hit. It was a huge, we haven't had anything like that in, this century, very, very long time. And it had a major impact on insurance and on people's lives. Events now, what is going on regarding world geopolitical economics and how insurance works around that. For example, I think the dark fleets, just as an example, how is insurance responding to that? Because these are the things that are going to equip people in the future about how they practice. It's almost like it's not even organizational learning, it's profession-wide learning. Again, we're doing this for a reason. So in 20 years' time, something will come out of our present situation that will dictate, inform how insurance is being practiced in 20, 30 years' time. But also, I've posed this question before. I've been looking at documents that are 500 years old before. I worked in archives and so on. And I mentioned these documents from the 1300s, and it's all handwritten by someone. What's going to happen to these podcasts, say in 500 years? So, Harry, 500 years' time, where are your podcasts going to be? Are they going to be in an archive? Are people going to be watching and listening to you? So that's informative of where we are right now.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's a long way away, I know, but...
It is a long way away, but yeah, one would like to think, I suppose, that there would be some sort of digital archive of all of the great podcasts that the Journal and our sister podcast over at PFP has done. We just don't know. I'm sure in 500 years, I'm unlikely to be around to see it.
Yes.
But it's a really pertinent question, Harry. Thank you for raising that. And also your answers throughout. It's really engaging to be chatting to someone who's got such a passion for the subject, because it really does come through. So thank you for sharing all of that and giving your time up to speak to us this morning.
No, thank you very much, Harry, and thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Journal podcast. You can find useful links in the show notes and related articles on the Journal website, along with further podcasts, many of which can be logged as CPD directly on the site with just one click. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, review, and subscribe. Until next time, goodbye.